As y'all know, I'm a part of an ecumenical Bible study. We meet Tuesday mornings of every week. This past week, we met at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Gaffney, South Carolina, with their pastor, the Reverend James Brown. He introduces himself over and over and over again as the real godfather of soul. Gets old about the 100th time. But in any case, Reverend Brown, Bucky is actually what we call him, was talking about the very first time that he preached on All Saints' Day. Now, Bucky's an interesting guy. He's a Lutheran pastor who was ordained as a Presbyterian, but attended seminary at an Anglican seminary in England. He's sort of the entire ecumenical movement wrapped up in one person. But Bucky said that they were actually sent out each week on preaching missions into the countryside. He attended Trinity College in Bristol. And the place that he sent for his very first sermon was a stone chapel in the English countryside. Now, if you've spent any time in England, you'll realize that the weather we have today, kind of cold and damp, is pretty much the norm in England. And that was what Bucky found that day. It was a cold, rainy day, and the old stone church in which he was to preach his very first sermon on the Feast of All Saints had no heat. It had never been heated. Instead, they warmed it in a very ancient fashion. Down the center of the center aisle were 3 large braziers, copper basins, filled with hot coals. Now, this church did not have pews. Instead, it had cathedral chairs. And as he was standing there delivering his very first sermon, the Feast of All Saints, he noticed that the people that were gathered that morning had brought their chairs close to those braziers filled with hot coals. And so looking down the aisle, there were 3 groups of people, each of them around those hot coals, holding their hands out, quite warm in an otherwise damp and chilly place. It's a strong image. And I'd actually like you to consider that as we move forward through the sermon. The people of God, of the church, gathered around those braziers seeking warmth. Today is the Feast of All Saints, November 1st, a feast day in the church which has been celebrated on this date for about 1,200 years, but a feast that has been celebrated farther in time even than that. The church has always held up those who have died in the faith. Initially, of course, it was people like Stephen, the deacon who was stoned to death, those who had given their life for the faith. But beginning about the 3rd or 4th century, it became the norm to lift up all of those in the faith who had died, to remember those faithful departed, those who had been a part of the community of believers before us. It was the norm to lift them up on a regular basis. And that's what we are doing this day. Now, interestingly enough, the readings that were chosen for today, the readings that are set aside actually in our lectionary for the Feast of All Saints. Today, Isaiah and Revelation and the Gospel according to John, those readings have something in common. They are readings that we would normally hear at a funeral. Isaiah, that rich feast that's proclaimed by Isaiah, it's about actually the end of death itself. And in Revelation, that reading where Jesus proclaims himself to be Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, it is the restoration of all creation. So we have the end of death being proclaimed, we have all creation being restored, and then we step into the gospel. And our gospel reading that we really associate with the rising of Lazarus is actually the second part of a 2-part reading, the first of which we almost always hear at a funeral. It's that moment when Mary's sister Martha confronts Jesus as he's entering the little village of Bethany. Now, what do we know about this family, Mary and Martha and Lazarus? Well, we know that they're pretty much the only family that's named that has a special relationship with Jesus. We know that they are friends. It's proclaimed in the text. But we also know that this is not the first encounter that they've had. Everybody knows the story of Mary and Martha, right? Remember, Jesus is in their home, and Mary is seated at his feet, which is the posture that a student takes to a rabbi. And what is Martha doing? Martha's bustling around the house, trying to make sure that the demands of hospitality are met. She's making sure that the house is prepared, that it's clean, and that the meal is prepared. We all hear about people that are Marthas, and we hear about people that are Marys, right? You know, every pastor I know, secretly, we're very happy to have lots of Marthas in the church. Marthas, the people that sort of are said to be the ones that get things done, that accomplish things. But actually, Martha's the one that gets sort of the raw end of the deal in that story, right? Because when she confronts Jesus in the story of Mary and Martha, he says, "Martha, Martha, you worry about too much. Mary has chosen the better portion." Mary, who has chosen to sit and listen and be transformed, to learn. That's what you should be about. Don't worry about these other things. Well, apparently that earlier conversation with Jesus had a great impact, because by the time that Lazarus has died, Martha has learned something. Martha has been transformed. It's Martha that confronts Jesus as he enters into Bethany. You can almost see her in the text sort of tapping him on the chest with her fingertips saying, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus doesn't deny that at all. He accepts her anger. He accepts her admonition. He doesn't deny its power, its validity at all. But he does ask her a question. Do you believe? And Martha, who had been so busy preparing the meal that she had not sat at his feet, Martha is the one who makes that great statement that no one else in the Gospel according to John does. She says, "I believe that you are the Messiah, the one coming into the world." Martha understood. Now, that's the first part of the reading. The second part, though, is the encounter with Mary. Mary, the one who had sat at his feet. Mary, who had understood from the very beginning. A lot of folks will tell you that this pericope, this story, is about the raising of Lazarus. But what actually happens? Mary, weeping, confronts Jesus. She is hurt. She is angry. She's inconsolable. "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." And what's his response? Jesus weeps along with her. Jesus acknowledges the grief of the moment. He acknowledges loss. Some would say that this story is about the raising of Lazarus. Actually, this story is about Jesus acknowledging something in each and every one of us. Jesus, the Son of the living God, is saying, grief and loss and hurt and mourning are real. And I share with you in that pain and in that hurt. Lazarus will be raised. But if you'd known the stories of Isaiah, if you'd known the power of Christ, that's a given. The power of this moment, though, is in Jesus' own vulnerability, in the fact that he grieves with us, that he mourns with us. That if you grieve the loss of a loved one, if you're angry at God for their death, it's okay. He stood in that moment and not only accepted it, but he wept along with Mary. Now, I was not with y'all a year ago today. Instead, I was on my sabbatical during the Feast of All Saints last year. And when I left here, I knew exactly what my sabbatical was about. It was about rest and it was about renewal. But the further away from Spartanburg I got, the further west I went, the closer I got to the home of my recently deceased brother, the more I realized that my sabbatical was about grief and loss and mourning. By the time I got to Canyon City, Colorado, I felt him beside me, my brother, riding with me. We walked together the same trails that we'd walked when he was living. I had his fly rod. And each cast that I made on the Arkansas, he was with me. The reality of his presence was overwhelming. The power of that moment, the power of these readings, the power of All Saints can actually be summed up in the words of an extraordinary writer, a gifted writer and theologian named Frederick Buechner. Speaking of All Saints and speaking of loved ones that he had lost, he says, "I cannot imagine who I would be without having had them in my life. I can't imagine who I would be without having had them in my life. Nor can I imagine it today because they are still with me." I look around this room and I see people that understand grief and loss and mourning. You've experienced it. And some of you that are young and have yet to know it. But you will. And the reality of that understanding and the reality of that moment will be powerful. It will be life-changing, but it should also be life-affirming. To know that in grief and loss, our Lord is with us. That we have hope. But we also have, more than hope eternal, the reality of the moment. Which brings us back to that little stone church near Bristol, England. And that young pastor who is proclaiming the Feast of All Saints with those braziers of hot coals lined up down the center aisle, with the people clustered around him. I asked him how he felt in that moment, looking out on that congregation. And it was a powerful moment for him, and it's a powerful moment, I think, for what we are trying to say. And that's about why we celebrate the Feast of All Saints, why we come to this place, why we lift up all of those names and we celebrate and remember all of those lives. Because here is a place where we will find purpose and hope and meaning and warmth in an otherwise cold and broken world. Here, in the midst of loss, in the midst of death, we find life. In the midst of mourning, we find hope. In the midst of this place, we find Christ. And it's from this place that we will go out proclaiming His love in a world with far too much loss. Amen.